Just let me know.
Yeah.
Good evening to you all. On behalf of Anna Jori, I welcome you to today's session on gender and sexuality, which is our topic for Thursdays. Anna Jori, collective non-profit platform to connect and create networks between writers, activists, translators from the Northeast, working on the Northeast and even outside. So this is a platform for everyone to get together and to create new conversations. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Aruni Kashyap. Aruni Kashyap is a writer and translator. He's the author of His Father's Disease, published by Context Westland Books India 2019, Flipped Eye Books in UK, and the novel The House with a Thousand Stories, published by Viking Penguin Random House 2013. He has also translated from Assamese and introduced the celebrated Indian writer Indira Goswami's last work of fiction, The Bronze Sword of Teng Fakhri Tehsildar, Zuban, 2013. He won the Charles Wallace India Trust Scholarship for Creative Writing to the University of Edinburgh, and his poetry collection, There Is No Good Time for Bad News, Future Cycle Press 2021, was a finalist for the 2018 Marsh Hawk Press Poetry Prize and 2018 Four-Way Books Levi's Award in Levis Award in Poetry. His short stories, poems, and essays have appeared in Catapult, the Boston Review, the Oxford Anthology of Writings from the Northeast, the Kenyon Review, the New York Times, and the Guardian UK, the Hindu, Evergreen Review, Kartika Review, Juked, and others. He is currently assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Georgia, Athens. He also writes in Assamese, and his first Assamese novel is Noikon Etia Duroit, published by Panchajanya Books in 2019. So welcome to you, Aruni. A great pleasure to have you on this webinar series on Thursdays. I have been reading some of your short fiction. I didn't get your novel, but I did read some of your short fiction, especially from the collection His Father's Disease. A very interesting array of short stories, and I kind of also see a lot of resonance between the stories, and a lot of common preoccupations with certain themes that you seem to be quite fond of exploring. So for the participants, just to let you know that this is going to be more of a conversation than the speaker, than Aruni giving a lecture or a talk. I will probably just start off the discussion with a few questions, and then later on, maybe the audience, is welcome to either post questions on the chat box or unmute yourself and ask questions to the speaker when the time arrives. So again, I welcome you all to today's discussion. So Aruni, to ask you my first question from what I have read and discussed in your, discussed myself in your short stories is, I noticed at least three strands, and there may be many more, but I noticed three predominant strands in your writings. One is, of course, your response or your partly sometimes also a slight discomfort, but it might be a little bit more complex than that. Reaction to American culture, especially your first impressions to America, your trips to America, also your travels within America, not you, but, your characters' travels within America. Especially, one very interesting space that I think I kind of identified a lot with is, the conference space, the space of the conference, the space of especially the literary conference, those mega festivals that we all, make our ritual, trips to, and sometimes it's almost this kind of ritual obligation that you have to do it. So that's one, and then the other thing, of course, is your preoccupation with issues around sexuality and gender, and then I also notice the other strand, which also kind of overlaps with the first strand, which is also what it means to be from the Northeast, and what it means to be a Northeasterner in the US, From what I've read, probably more so in the US than in the Indian non-northeastern land, let me say, in India. So these are like three major strands that I have identified. I'm sure there are more. So let me just begin asking you, like, were these themes or ideas something that came to you naturally, obviously from your own background, or is this something that you have been thinking about for a while? What is your creative process?
Yeah, I think all of these seeps into my stories very naturally, because these are things I think about all the time. These are things I care about. These are things I worry about. So it's very natural that things I care about, think about, and worry about seeps into my creative process all the time. Uh, and of course, these three sort of themes or strands, they develop over time. For example, um, in so many ways, I think the Story collection, also my first novel, is about what it really means to be from Assam, growing up in the 90s and the 80s under the duress of absolute state violence, as well as violence from numerous insurgency groups. And in between that, the common people had suffered so much in the last 3-4 decades. Since 1979, Assam has changed and violence has taken over our lives. In some ways, sometimes there are people who don't even know about the violence because of this information campaign of the Indian state. So that is one concern that I have always been very sort of moved by and curious about, and also at times infuriated about. So that's one thing. So obviously, while growing up, while obviously while growing up in Assam, this concern became one of my big issues, and a lot of my early work actually is about negotiating uh, this location that I come from. Then after that, I moved to Delhi in 2004 to study literature. For the first time, I realized that I'm a Northeastern. Before that, I was an Assamese, and suddenly I'm a Northeastern, and I was really iffy about that identity that I was imposed on. People imposed that identity on me, and it's very funny because you grow up, like if you grow up in, say, Tamil Nadu, you're not expected to have knowledge about all the, uh, um, all the movements and history of Kerala or Karnataka, right? But if you grow up in Northeast, you go to a conference in Delhi, and they kind of assume or kind of guess, maybe because I don't even have eyebrows, or I have almost no eyebrows. I'm like very typically Northeastern that way. So they look at my eyebrows probably and see, oh my God, that must be a person from the Northeast. Let me ask him what he thinks about the history of Manipur. And like after every and out of curiosity, I would go to these conferences, and whenever there is a question, or whenever there is like a sensitive topic about the Northeast, like everybody would turn their heads and look at me, because I'm the only one, or I'm like among the five ones in the hall, and they expect me to have an opinion about Nagaland's history. I'm like, no, I know what's happening, but I don't have an opinion because I'm not an expert in Nagaland's history. I'm here. I'm here at this attending this conference because, just like you guys, I don't know anything about these things, or I know little about these things. So that is one thing, or I care. So that's the Northeastern part. I moved to the US in 2011 after finishing college in Delhi University, and that really sort of brought me to a completely new culture. And I went also at an age when I had already read like Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, um, Zora Neale Hurston. I read Chimamanda Adichie's Immigrant Narratives. I read Chinua Achebe, and quite a lot of like Indian American novels that kind of that express the diasporic concerns. So
Ah,
I
ah,
went to
ah, ah.
America not with starry eyed, but with a very critical sort of. Oh, okay. I went to America. Somebody laughed at my joke. I was not cracking a joke. Thank you. I went to America with a very critical eye, and Also, I had read Noam Chomsky, Anthony Arnov, and I have read Arundhati Roy on all of these things. These are things that I grew up discussing in Delhi University. So I went to the United States, not with the gratitude that most Indian Americans go, and that glaring, garish gratitude that you see in the faces of Indian Americans. That was not me. I was like very critical. I was very curious. I knew what was wrong with America, and I knew what was beautiful about America. And I chose to look at those beautiful things. I knew that I love jazz. I knew that I would go to Chicago to the Buddy Guys Club. I knew that I would always seek out good writing. America is an amazing space for good writing, good literature. It is the place where creative writing, teaching has been institutionalized. I knew about the really sort of eclectic history of immigration about America. So I came very much informed as a person when I went to America. I think this would not have been my critical eye. I wouldn't have this critical eye if I were 19 years old and did my undergraduate, probably, or maybe I would not have this critical eye if I did STEM. So anyway, I don't know. I was not 19. I was, I think, 26. So I was very aware of the United States' role in, I had read Denis Levertov, Vietnam War poems. I knew about the protest against Vietnam War. I just knew about I knew so much about the United States, and my friends in the United States knew nothing about India. Like, forget about Assam or Guwahati. They knew nothing about Delhi. They knew about Taj Mahal. So that disparity was really jarring to me. Like you have a smartphone, like all the time you're constantly posting on Facebook. You have a smartphone in your hands, and you know nothing about this country, and you know nothing about beyond, like you don't know anything beyond Minnesota. Like, the Minnesota was the place, and like if something is happening in Minneapolis, that was news to them. So this insularity, I think seeps into American mainstream literary culture as well, which is very rich, but at the same time very insular. And all of these concerns actually seeps into the daily life as well, and so I was interested in capturing that. And the characters that I write about are not necessarily racist, but they're really ignorant, and that ignorance creates friction. And that friction was something I was interested in, because I don't think the typical Indian American person actually faces racism the way a Black person would face. But at the same time, we face microaggressions, and we face all these really quirky questions, and that are very sort of um, friction producing. Let me say that. Yeah. So all these three concerns are definitely very natural, but at the same time not by accident. Um, it is mainly because I have experienced these things.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for giving us a sense of the kinds of readings that you have been doing, especially when you talk about the richness of the American literary imagination, and the kind of ironic contrast between the imagination and the insularity of certain places in the US, especially talking about the place where you currently live. It's very interesting that you kind of remarked on that. So I find it interesting that many of your characters. I was thinking also of since we are on this topic, I was thinking of the last story which you wrote in His Father's Disease, which is, I think, called After Anthropology. It's
I
yeah.
guess,
So I
yes, I think that's the
yeah
last story. Yes.
yes. So I found that a little remarkable, and I kind of also identified with the character there, with Raj, because I mean, as you said, I mean, I think we've had slightly different experiences of the US, because I went when I was much younger, and I went there with exactly with what you said, stars in my eyes. With a lot of hope, and it seemed like this amazing lease of freedom in every sense of the word. But then, it wears off. After a point, you do get a little uh, disillusioned or a little blasé about the whole thing. So yeah, so and it's interesting that I kind of see that critical eye that you're talking about in your fiction, about what it means to actually go there maybe at later stage. So your characters seem to have that kind of that discerning eye. There's a certain discomfort that there's a very kind of palpable discomfort that some of your characters feel when they go to the US or when they even move within the US. And so, for example, the character of Raj in the last story, and when he meets his boyfriend or his husband's or his partner's father, who is this Republican, that discomfort I think was very palpable. Like not knowing not being able to pinpoint initially what he doesn't like about the father, and then he realizes that there is something else to it. A certain patriarchal presence occupies a lot of space, doesn't let his partner speak, guzzles beer all the time, and I think it was very well captured, the father's character. And of course the ultimate revelation, which I will not reveal here, but that sense of shock towards the end of the story, which I think came out very well. So could you maybe kind of address some of the other strands? I mean, one of course is, I think you mentioned this about the sense of violence and violation that people from the Northeast feel, especially when they are in India. And I think I think the title story of that collection, I think for me was one of the finer stories which I'd read. I think his father's disease, which I think was very well crafted, very well, composed. And I think it also questions about sexuality and sexual orientation, along with larger questions of communal violence and identity. So is that something that you have been kind of consciously like do all your stories? Because I get that sense that many of your stories have this very kind of a keen nexus, a keen connection between maybe orientation, different axes, different vectors of identification and marginalization.
Yeah, thank you so much for making those really lovely and very pertinent observations. Yes, talking about after anthropology, I'm also not going to reveal the end, of course, because it's so surprising. It actually happened to a friend of mine, and so I want to say that it really happened, And when I heard it, I was very shocked, and I really wanted to negotiate that, and and I said, this is like, how can this person do this, Like, I have heard of overt racism, people actually like discriminating or physically attacking. So, but this was something very different and very interesting. So I found it really sort of, I found it really interesting that this happened, But so coming to that, I think. I think I'm really interested in the marginalized voice, of course. So that is why the characters I write about are in some ways outsiders. They are I don't think I have most of them are from lower middle class backgrounds, middle class background, and a lot of them are queer. A lot of them are in many ways they look at the world from being excluded from the centers or the circles of privilege. And I think it's a very empowering vision. I think it's a very empowering lens. That is why I don't want to write about, write from the perspective, or I don't want to write about people who are in power, because their vision is so limited. They're drunk with power usually, and they don't know how they themselves look when they are seen from the margins. But looking at, for example, as a person growing up in Assam during the violence, looking at the Indian state from the margins gave me a very different perspective of India than my friends who grew up in Delhi, Bombay, or Calcutta. So that perspective is so valuable that it enables me to engage in critical dialogue with my citizenship, with my rights. That is something is not available, and this richness of vision is not available to somebody who grew up in Delhi. They are much more impoverished than us, that is why actually probably different levels of marginality is appealing to me, because I know despite the discrimination, it's a really powerful situation to be in. It's a really powerful subject position to occupy. It enables you to have the critical dialogue with the society around you. The people who are powerful are so are not able to. They're not able to because they are completely intellectually impoverished compared to people who are in the margins. So that's why it's really appealing to me.
One thing that you do very well is, capture the tensions, exactly what you're talking about, tensions of race and citizenship and being an outsider, in the academic space. I think that's something that you do very well in some of your short stories about characters who step into a conference and, end up being, let's say, the only Indian there, or they're kind of dubbed as a spokesperson for South Asia at large, or they end up bonding with other people who are from South Asia, either maybe from neighboring countries like Bangladesh, or and there's a certain there's a constant need to want to bond with someone. Especially one of your characters who is this Assamese writer who can barely speak English, and then manages to go to a conference. And then I think it's the opening story. I think it was really well done, where you are able to actually intersperse his retellings of a very well-known Assamese folktale with a larger frame, the frame of academia, class, and social hierarchies within the academia. Especially the kind of frictions between well-meaning liberal white Americans and those people who are not Americans, or who don't actually identify with these people, end up asking them questions about challenging their supposed or apparent liberalism. I kind of noticed these very interesting frictions in some of your short stories, and this is something that I could identify with, because having been in the American academia myself and going to all these conferences, again, there's one thing I kind of realized, especially if it's not a conference which is not on South Asia, but is largely on, let's say, one of those large conferences, which is like the Madison Conference on Asia, which includes everything from Japan all the way down to almost touching the Middle East. So it's and you end up feeling completely lost. And there is this kind of anxiety that builds up, because you need to actually prove something. You actually have to prove something. You have to compete with someone. You have to there's always, it's very implicit, but it's on your face. And of course, there's this crazy need to want to network with people. Maybe this kind of strange hope or promise of getting a job, or I don't know what it is, this kind of crazy rat race to be visible, be seen at all these conferences. But your characters, I think, have this other problem which comes out really well, which is that they either have problems with English, or they have other problems in being seen along with a crowd which is largely white. Questions of class come in. So it's very interesting. I mean, I think that's something that I could really identify with, that the anxiety and the tension of belonging and not belonging, or trying to belong in an academic space, and the academia itself becoming a space of hierarchies. So would you like to? Because I know you're obviously part of the circuit yourself. So is this something that you have been thinking about for a long time? Your identity in the academia, maybe in your own department, as someone who teaches creative writing and so on.
Can you just repeat the question? It was I missed the
Yeah.
question.
So I was just saying that is this something that you have been consciously thinking of yourself, especially as part of your creative writing process, as being part of like, for example, I think you kind of mentioned to me earlier that you were in this university in a small midwestern town, and you kind of might have felt a little lost, of struggle to find ways of belonging, and trying to have conversations with people. So is this something that has obviously inspired your writing in some ways?
Absolutely. Actually, the anxiety that my character feels in the love lives of people who look like Kalpen
Yes.
or Skylar Girl, they are very like anxieties that I can actually relate to. And one of the reasons is, of course, because the loneliness of the Northeastern academic in international academia. If you are a person from Northeast, I'm talking about 10 years, 12 years ago, you like nobody works on Northeast, like nobody works on subjects of Northeast. That loneliness itself automatically makes you an outsider. That was very hard to be a person from the Northeast and contribute. So I used to write about Assamese literature. So that really sort of landed me in different South Asian studies, conferences. And what I found, it was really, I was very amused because here I am interested in literary studies, but South Asian studies is interested in literary studies, but they're also interested in history, sociology, politics. And these are their primary prisms of looking at the world. My primary prisms of looking at the world is narrative, dialogue, characterization, beauty, imagery, simile, metaphor. And I didn't find that I had a place there. But at the same time, looking for a community, I had to go. And even now, 10 years later, I'm a professor right now in the University of Georgia. I teach in a creative writing program. And because I'm from Assam, I end up writing a lot about Assamese literature, sometimes about politics, but rarely, but mostly I write about Assamese literature and Indian literature. Even now, people request me to be in dissertation committees or panels, for example, about Majuli, or for example about not Majuli. Like I know somebody who works on. I know a couple of people who works on Majuli. They never ask me. But for example, like the history of the Naga insurgency, um, and why should I be in a thesis committee on the history of Naga insurgency? I'm not a historian. I'm a creative writer. I'm a literary artist. These are not literary concerns. And I find it very amusing that people think that I'm from the Northeast. Very flattered to be in these committees. And it is very interesting because I have been in similar kind of conferences where I was in a literary conference, but inadvertently in literary conferences nowadays, there are people who work in Department of Religion, people who work in Department of History, because they write popular nonfiction books after a point of time in their career, which they do very wonderfully because they're bringing their years of research and experience to talk about a complex issue in a more mainstream way, in a more popular way, in a more accessible way. So I see there's a lot of value in that. But I was at this conference in the US, which was a predominantly South Asian group, and there was a person, a white man, who works on South Asia, and I was sitting with my friend who is a novelist from Nigeria, and I was and we were waiting for another novelist to have breakfast together, and this man repeatedly comes to request me to go and meet the other South Asian studies people. And I kept on telling him that I'm not interested in South Asian studies. I'm happy to meet them and be friends with them, but he kept on saying, "Why are you here? Like you should be with the other South Asians." I said, "Why? Because I'm brown. That's why. Because I'm Indian, should I be with Indians only? I'm with a novelist. This, my friend, is a novelist. I'm a novelist. This is what is common between us. Why are you repeatedly asking me to go and sit with a historian from South Asia? Because I have nothing common between them except we are Indians." So these are tensions that I think are very interesting, and people fail to see that I'm a storyteller and I'm a literary artist. A lot of their concerns are not my common concerns. Just because somebody is Indian, I don't want to hang out with them. Just because somebody who works on Indian history or Indian sociology, I'm not interested in having academic conversations with them, or I'm not interested may not be having intellectual debates with them, especially when I'm at a conference of writers. I want to meet other literary artists, other novelists, other poets, other essayists who think about the art of writing. Though that's my concern. That's what I teach. That's what I do every day in the morning. So I think you were very right in pointing out that I have been an outsider in all these conferences, and it gives me again a very sort of interesting perspective, let's to say the least. And I think it's at times these tensions are funny. I think about that man who thought that he was doing me a favor by introducing me to the other South Asian studies scholars, because I was new in America. And I keep laughing about it, thinking that this guy has no idea about writing. This guy doesn't know how a novelist thinks. This guy has no idea what a poet thinks. He just thinks, oh, this person is from the Northeast and he writes about Northeast. Let me introduce him to somebody from Tamil Nadu who works on caste movement. So it's really funny and very amusing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we share similar experiences, especially because in the first story, Skylark Girl, I love that moment where there is the kind of friction between the questioner, the woman who asks a question to Shonji about his presentation, not knowing why. So the kind of question she asks, the mode in which the question is asked, is why don't you address questions of insurgency and violence. Like I think that becomes a very important kind of a critique, if you like, of the way in which people think about literature. I mean, I think that should be, I think, the identifying marker, not rather than South Asian. What medium or what form do you use to actually talk about, let's say, any issue, even if it were an issue about insurgency and violence? How would you imagine the issue as opposed to writing a historical or a political document about the insurgency? I kind of like the irony that you built in, especially when Sanjeev, talks about, I mean, retells a story and a very well-known Assamese folktale, and then says that this folktale is about, you know, perseverance, courage, not being defeated, and so on. And as opposed to, stories which are more obvious, explicit portrayals of what it means to be undefeated, what it means to be resistant, what it means to be, so to not bow down before state pressure or state violence. So I think that was actually a very interesting, and I like the fact that the transitions between I mean, it was almost seamlessly done. The inner story and the frame story of the academy and academia. The other interesting thing that I noticed about your writing also is, especially it comes out in his father's disease, which is the fact that, one of the things that literature can do, which is why people like your characters in the Skylark Girl find it very uncomfortable, is the fact that in literature you can have ambiguities, right? I mean, I think literature thrives on ambiguities, on subtleties, right? And you can't quite do away with ambiguities and subtleties. You can't wish it away. It can't. I mean, even if it were a utopian world, an imagination of a utopian world, you cannot get there without ambiguities. You cannot rest on that point without friction. Without some kind of contradiction, some irony. What is literature without irony, right? So that's something that kind of constantly came to my mind, especially when you were talking about in the father's disease. That there's a very fantastic moment between the and so I'll give it away a little bit here to the participants, so I can't talk about it, which is that I like the space, the use of space in that story. Especially the outhouse, the extension of the house, the main house. I think you did a wonderful job of executing space to talk about shifting intimacies, shifting loyalties, mixed loyalties, right? Especially loyalties to the family, a loyalty to, maybe one's own sexual orientation, sexual self, and also along mixed with animosity and antagonism towards the state, towards the army, and intimacies. How intimacies intermingle with hostilities and prejudice and bigotry. So that's something that maybe you could probably comment on, because I know that literature does that, and I think a lot of other people who are from political science or from anything, activists, they we just cannot see eye to eye, because I think even if literature for me, I would say kind of literature actually reveals a lot more of the truth than we would like to accept, right? Than we would like to actually take. But I think a lot of people are actually very uncomfortable with that. And I think there's a very slippery line to be drawn between a text that participates in, let's say, bigotry and prejudice, and a text which portrays it and is ironic about it. So maybe if you'd like to comment on that.
The South African novelist Nadine Gordimer, um, uh, who won the Nobel Prize for her anti-racist novels and essays. She wrote like many collections of essays, but she always said, if you really want to know the truth about South Africa, please read my novels. Don't read my essays. nothing I say here is as true as my fiction. That's what she said. And I really understand that, because fiction has an emotional truth that is not possible to be captured by any other medium. Just the way fiction will never do what journalism does or political science will do. In the same way, fiction has its own taxonomy, and or literature has its own taxonomy, you know. And what we try to do is that we try to capture the emotional truth, which is full of ironies, which is full of ambiguities, which is full of forces that are contradictory, which basically the current neoliberal conversation, which is very shallow and only acts out of personal injury and not out of lived experience, actually tries to pinpoint everything and actually sort of capture everything and reduce everything and reduce the ambiguities and ironies of literature into bite-sized capsules that you can sort of fork it up and eat, you know. And that's the huge problem and huge reduction of literature. It's not just a reduction of literature, it's actually an act of dehumanization, because literature is about people. So if you're not accepting its ambiguities, if you're not accepting the shifting loyalties, and if you're not accepting irony in life, if you're not accepting torn royalties, you probably don't know anything about life, and then you don't have the right to call yourself an activist on Twitter.
In fact, some of your short stories reminded me of Tejimola Ao's own writings. I remember some of Tejimola Ao's own writings on the insurgency, and some of them I kind of read the entire collection, Those Hills Called Home, overnight, and it was extremely moving, very moving experience. And I think she does exactly that. She kind of brings out the ambiguities of intimacies across sections, across opposing sides, the impossibility of being able to identify a victim and a perpetrator beyond a point. Who is a perpetrator to whom, and who, so I think there's a lot of blurring of lines that I think, and I noticed in many of her short stories. The other aspect that maybe you could probably throw some light on is, there's this other very powerful story called Busy Colony. And it was very moving, because I think I have been kind of dipping my hands into some of this literature on mental health, and and one of the things I noticed, of course, is that very powerful character called Bablu. And I find it very fascinating, the way you have portrayed the emotional impact that the boys' mental health issues have had on the family. And and you've also peppered that deep sense of tragedy and pathos with humor. And I kind of found that contrast very refreshing. I mean, I found it very fascinating, actually, to see the kind of humor you kind of peppered it with humor here and there, especially those moments where you notice that there's a heightening of the pathos and the tragedy of the story. So it's actually very interesting that that a lot of what we get to know about the character is through his outbursts, and through the impact that his outbursts and his violent outbursts have on the family. But I also was wondering if is there a possibility of actually getting into the head of the character more? I mean, is that something that you had thought of? That were you personally satisfied with the story?
Hi, can you hear me, Kiran?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Hello, sir. Can you hear us?
Yes. Aruni?
Hello, sir.
Aruni? Yes, I can hear you, Pallavi. Is it his internet?
Yeah, it's his internet. I'm stopping his video for now, so that then I'll again. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Sir,
I
can
think
you unmute yourself?
yeah,
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah,
yes.
sorry about that. I mean, as I said, I have 5G, but even 5G is not reliable when the whole world is zooming, So you are talking about Bablu, I remember, and I
Yes,
missed
yes,
the question
yes.
basically.
No, so I was just thinking about Bablu, and this might sound a little
Mhm.
bit like a critique, but this is something I'd like to push you more into. The Bablu's character is very interesting because we get a sense of his character through his violent outbursts and the emotional impact that the outbursts have on his family, right? Especially on his brother and on his parents. And you also have moments of humor. It almost sounds ironic, to have humor at points where the story kind of arrives or achieves this tragic peak. There's especially at the moments of pathos, so you suddenly have the family cracking a joke about something. Did you? I mean, the sense that I got is that I was completely drawn to the character of Bablu, and I was very fascinated by uh, what he said, right? Especially his obscenities, his foul-mouthedness, his very. What struck me the most is the paradox, the way the character swings from one pole to another, a pole of extreme affection and extreme longing and desperation for love, and on the other hand, this absolute violence, this kind of really destructive violence that comes across. It's and I find it really interesting that if you can kind of contrast this with his father's disease, although his father's disease is not really about disease or of any sort, but it's being imagined as some form of disorder, um, especially an intergenerational kind of disorder between father and son. But in this case, it is it's actually a case of a mental issue, right? So do you feel like mental health is something that is a very fertile ground for literary creativity?
I don't know if mental health is a fertile ground for literary creativity, but I do think people should write more about mental health issues. I think we must normalize it because it happens to everyone, and we must normalize conversations, enabling conversations around mental health. So that's the direct answer to your question. And like in his father's disease, the mother thinks that there's an intergenerational transfer of sexuality, which is the only way she can make sense of. Otherwise, she'd just absolutely she devastated, because when she realizes that her son is gay, and and she's not a literate person. We have to remember she's from a rural space. She's a regular rural lady who goes to the fields, paddy fields. They're poor, they're not educated. He even didn't finish his education, so she doesn't have access to the conversations about identity, sexuality that many of us have. So the only way she can make sense of is just find a pattern. And also I think it ties up to the larger conversation about in the 80s when I think the bodies of queer men and women, they were considered as diseased or carriers of disease, especially during the AIDS epidemic. So the idea of disease and sexuality has a very long history in both in literature and also in the world, because people who were queer were considered as carriers, or their bodies were considered disease and rejected by the society. So I think there's a long conversation that we can have about that separately also. Um, the mental health issues in this, there is the only way in Busy Colony the family can cope with their tragedy is actually by laughing about things that are really sort of silly in their lives. There are many different sort of versions of this. Like I wrote a much longer story and actually cut out a lot in some chopped portions. There are times when the Bablu character actually makes his family repeat it 3 times because he has a certain kind of OCD. So if you say, for example, um, no, bhat khalane, khalu, like did you have rice? Yes, I had rice. He would have to have listen to the answer twice. So he would force his family members to speak it twice, and that became a joke in the family, over the course of time. So, and like, so he would say, haha, like, I want you to say it 3 times, otherwise I'll just lose it. And if you don't say that, he will turn violent. So it's very insidious, but at the same time, for a family that is trying to cope so much with the sadness that their son is not well, and they're not able to make sense of it because there is no conversation in our society about it, and there is stigma associated with it. I'm talking about the 90s and early 2000s. So the only way they can cope with it and live with it is actually laugh with themselves, laugh at themselves, laugh at their own tragicomic predicament. That is why there is humor. Otherwise, the story would be so bleak. And otherwise, also, like Bablu had a lot of humorous moments in his life, despite his illness, and we must honor and celebrate that.
I think one more thing I kind of noticed also, especially when you talk about questions
Kiran,
of
I can't hear you. Could you be louder?
yeah. So one more thing which I kind of notice when you talk about questions of identity is that especially in the opening story, um, the love life, not the opening story, but the story called the love lives of people who look like Carl Penn. The very title of the story itself seems to be quite suggestive of what the narrator or the characters understand by identity, especially when they are in a place where they don't belong. And I think you did it very well at the level of the sentence, where very often characters remark they don't really know anyone as such. So when they talk about somebody else, they don't know what to say about them, except for the fact that this person thinks I look like Carl Penn. This is the person who associates me with this. This is the person, and I found very interesting that you kind of there are moments where you don't mention the character's name initially. You mention the character's name later on as someone whose name refers to this. There's a list of things, right? And that I think brought out that sense of alienation very well. That you don't identify a person as somebody with whom you have shared, let's say, a common life, a common journey, right? You don't have common habits, you don't have a common culture, right? But then you identify people in terms of these empirical things. You kind of list them out. He's the one who thinks that I look like this. He's or she said that this, and so I find that very interesting. You have those sentences here and there where you kind of it's a person's identity were a list of attributes, right, and nothing more than that. It's almost like an empty signifier. And so that's something that I actually kind of noticed in this short story. Um, is there anything, in terms of your own creative processes, probably for the benefit also of the audience or people who would like to start writing or have already written something? Uh, you know, uh, of course, it requires discipline. It requires everyday practice. You need to actually sit down to explore your own potential when you start writing something. Um, what would you say would be some of the most crucial things to be able
Yes.
to write, and write well?
Right. I missed your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I was just asking you, like, on the basis of your own creative process, what would you say are some of the most important ingredients for someone who actually wants to write well? I'm sure you've been asked this question many times, but in terms of, let's say, your own reading habits, I know reading goes with along with writing. So, in terms of your own reading habits, or in terms of your own writing practice, what would you like to say?
Well, I'm first and foremost, I'm a very, very omnivorous reader. I'm not herbivorous. I'm not carnivorous. I'm an omnivorous reader, which means that I read thrillers, erotica, detective novels, literary fiction, absurdist work, everything. I read everything. Everything that is a good story, fantasy, sci-fi, um, I don't know, like you just name it. I read everything actually. So that's really important for me. And it has really helped me to actually explore my own voracious reading appetite. But at the same time, I'm very, very interested in reading anything that is a good story, because I think there's much to learn from each other. So I would say that to be able to write, and what has served me most in all my life is that I read a lot when I was growing up. I read a lot when I was undergraduate. I read a lot when I was in grad school. The reading all these years has sort of, I never regret that I spent, oh my God, I think 20 years later, if you spend like the entire 2020 reading books, and God forbid we survive all this pandemic, we will never look back at 2020 and say, oh my God, I wasted 2020 because I read books. We would never say that. And I don't think I'm not very proud of my academic achievements in college and all, because I never really cared about the exams. But I'm very proud of the fact that I read so much. And because I was not out of any kind of evangelist and moralistic reason, I just loved reading. People loved playing. People love playing basketball. I love reading, and 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 people used to also like make fun of me, like, how much can you read? I'm like, how much can you play basketball? So it's the same way basically, and that really has served me very well in my life, reading extensively. Um, but I'm a little biased. I read a lot of fiction instead of reading a lot of poetry. And I don't read a lot of nonfiction. I read nonfiction when I have to do research for my work. And I read nonfiction when I have to teach or because of my course. I also don't like teaching literary theory, like as an academic, that's kind of weird. But I read it when I need to, and I find it very interesting, but I just think that they're very time consuming to read, so I don't read them. But otherwise, I'm a very voracious reader of fiction, memoir, essays. I mean, nonfiction, I read memoir and personal essays a lot. I love reading and writing the personal essay. And of course, as you said, it needs discipline. And people don't understand that writing is like learning music. Writing is like being an athlete. Writing, being a literary artist is all about practice. You don't get better just by not writing. Sometimes there'll be a burst of inspiration, and you write a good page or a good short story or for 6 months. But if you really want to do it seriously and if you want to be productive, the only way you can do it is by writing. That's the only way. There's no other way. People think there must be like tips about it. People think that taking creative writing courses with Orhan Pamuk will make them great writers. No, if that's the case, Columbia University, where Orhan Pamuk teaches, would have been producing the greatest writers in the world, but they don't. They produce the same quality writers that Iowa produces or University of Minnesota produces in their creative writing program, or my University of Georgia produces. So going to learn from a great writer definitely helps, but the great writers, what they have to say and what they have to teach are already in the libraries.
Would you say that you have a greater felicity with the short story as a form, as opposed to the novel? Has your experience been different between writing short stories and novels?
No, I find writing short stories very hard. I find it's the hardest art form. I find it easy to write poems. I find it easy to write personal essays or academic essays also. Not really academic essays, but let's say literary analysis. I don't like writing academic essays. But I find short story very, very hard to do. I actually can write a novel. Like, give me 6 months, I'll give you a 500,000 word long novel. It's not difficult for me. But give me 1 year, but I can't give you 2 short stories. I don't know if you heard that because my connection was unstable. I was saying that give me 6 months, I'll give you a 500,000 word long novel. But if you give me 1 year, I may not be able to give you 2 short stories. I can write novels, long prose, essays very easily, poetry very easily. I think it's like because I'm like I like writing the long narrative. I like writing the long form. Yeah, it involves a lot of physical labor though.
Yes. No, I think one of the things I actually noticed about some of your short stories is that it doesn't seem to always have a sense of closure. There's a lot of build up, and somewhere you think that all this is going to lead somewhere, but there are times when it just ends. It just ends when you least expect it to end. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying I just noticed that sometimes it just feels like it's an everyday, it's an everyday event in someone's life. It just begins and it ends when it's supposed to end. Like it doesn't have this, it's not this surprise twist towards the end. It's not, one of those, it's not a neat closed ending. Sometimes I just feel like it ends all of a sudden. The other thing is that you've written also in Assamese too. So
Because I'm lazy.
Sorry.
I say it's because I'm lazy. That's why I end it.
Okay. Well, I do think.
I say it's because I'm lazy.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, no, but I do think ending a story is actually quite hard. It's very challenging, not knowing how to end something. But the thing is that you also write in Assamese. So is writing in Assamese and writing in English, has it been a different aesthetic experience for you, or is it just a matter of writing? Yeah, I'm not sure if you heard me. Yeah, so yeah.
I think yeah. Hi. Yeah. So
Yes.
I haven't got a chat from somebody. Okay. Anyway, so I think one of the things I want to talk about the short story is that this Rabindranath Tagore actually said somewhere that a short story is something that is shesh hoyu hoilo na shesh, which means that for people who don't understand Bangla, it ends but it doesn't end. It's almost like you're looking out of the world through a window. But a novel is like opening the door and stepping out into the lawn and going across the lawn and taking to the road. So I think that's the reason why best short stories are ones that sort of evokes a little bit of slice of life and tells us something through that slice. That's the kind of thing I try to achieve in a short story. But as I said, I find it very difficult to write short stories. Every short story in the collection, if I sit down, give somebody says, Aruni, here is the money every month. I'm your benefactor. I'll turn them into a novel, each one of them, because I can take the narratives ahead very easily. But I cannot craft it into a story. But talking about your Assamese, my Assamese writing, I feel that I'm equally satisfied writing in Assamese as well as English, but I do write Assamese almost as a sense of duty, because I read Gugiwa Thiongo when I was in college, and who talked about not being enslaved by language, and who talked about writing in your own language as much as possible, who himself is a bilingual writer. And maybe I'm trying to decolonize my mind by writing in Assamese. I don't know. But I do enjoy writing in Assamese. I debuted as an Assamese writer. I wrote a column for 1.5 years before I ever wrote and published anything in English. My early short stories were all out in Assamese. The first novel I ever wrote that nobody published was in Assamese. The second novel I ever wrote that nobody published was in Assamese. The third and the fourth and the fifth, all of them were in Assamese, but no one published it. Then I wrote an English novel and someone published it. So I'm an Assamese writer. I just happen to write in English by accident.
Thank you, Aruni. Now let us just turn to the participants or to the audience. If you have any questions, then please you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can post your questions in the chat box.
That was lovely, Kiran. Thank you for asking and reading my collection so carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so far we just have a comment from Mayuri who says that she really loved My Father's Disease. She was completely fascinated by it, and she thinks it's a very fine composition.
Thank you, Mayuri,
yes. Any other questions or comments? Please ask.
I can see some familiar people. They should feel free to ask me questions.
Yes.
Somebody whose name is not there is asking me, how are you, privately, and I'm very well.
Oh.
Trying to survive 2020.
I see.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yes, Agnid, yes. Hi.
Hi. Okay. How are you, sir? First of all.
I'm very well. How are you doing? Thank you for coming to the Zoom conference.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad that I could come. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I just thought I would ask something that has been plaguing my mind a bit. So, okay, so
Hmm.
when you write a book like The Father's Disease, it is very, in a sense, I'll even call it overwhelming with emotions. It is very strongly running on the wheels of emotions, right? So, when you talk about the memories of Assam that you have that you use to write a particular story, it's very easy to have a memory of how a particular place looks or how a particular group of people talk. But is it equally easy to have the memory of the kind of things a person felt back when they were in that place so many years back? So yeah, that's my question.
I think this might sound absolutely nutty, but I think writing is also about accessing the collective unconscious. And every morning I sit down to write, and every morning I sit down to write, and it's like um, things happen magically. Like I plan to write a scene, it doesn't go according to me, it takes its own course. So I think there has to be something really innate, and and sort of magical about writing. I believe in that. I believe that it's a gift that everybody doesn't have, and but people who can hone it, storytelling sometimes, if not even writing, is something that is a gift, that you get it. There are, in villages, there are always wonderful storytellers. They don't write, but they are very good riveting storytellers. So I think when Mamani Roysam Goswami, who basically wrote Dotal Hati Uekwa Hauda, and she said that when she was writing Dotal Hati Uekwa Hauda, she was in Delhi, the Market and Howdah of a Tusker. But she remembered everything from her childhood vividly when she was writing the Market and Howdah of a Tusker, you know. So and I think there is something that we can't explain, and you do remember. Another thing is that writers are generally very observant people, and they observe very acutely, very minutely. One of the reasons they can write is because they observe and are very sensitive. And I think that is the reason why a lot of writers, who can write accurately the memories from their childhood, from their teenage, even when they are 40 years old, and it's sort of possible to do that. That's why.
Thank you so much. I really
You're
think that
welcome.
gives a lot of insight.
Okay.
Thank you for asking the question.
Yes, Aruni, there are a couple of questions in the chat box. One
Right.
is, of course, a question that you've already addressed, but if you want, you can address it again by Prathana. I have read your Assamese fiction and non-fiction. What are the ingredients to be a writer?
Just read widely and write every day. People think that being a writer means one has to be published. I will be a writer if even I'm not published. I got published for the first time in 2006, I think, in Amara Home. Um, but I was writing since I was 10 years old, and I was submitting. I wanted to publish, but I was submitting since I was in high school, class 8 and 9. I used to go to Bismoy magazine and submit. I used to go to Nobogiri Prantik and submit. I used to submit stuff in Sentinel, in Assam Tribune. I used to go to Maya magazine, the pulp magazine, and go and submit stories, and and like literally beg them to publish me, but they would not publish me. And all the stories are with me. The only way one can be a writer is by reading widely and by writing every day. If you want to be a writer, these are the two things nobody becomes a singer by not singing. But I think people make the mistake saying, I will be inspired, I will have time, and then I will write. It doesn't work like that. George Jenney was writing in the jail. So please, write. That's all. That's all is the only ingredient you need, and read widely.
Right. Absolutely. Then there's another question, Aruni, from a friend of mine who was very nice of him to join us from Melbourne. And he's also a recently published short story writer himself, Barry Lee Thompson. And he has a question, which is he says, I was interested in Aruni saying that all the great writers' teachings are already in the library. I wonder if he could talk a little about what he sees are the benefits of creative writing teaching, or of teaching creative writing.
Yes, definitely. Since I do one, I must support my vocation. Otherwise, like I have to keep my job. Thank you for asking that question, Barry. I think when I was young, the writing was such a solitary process, and I wish I had a mentor, and I wish I had someone who I could show my work to. Uh, that is the most valuable thing that anyone who is a beginning writer, an apprentice writer, could actually get. Um, when people come to do MFA or PhD in creative writing, my program is a PhD in creative writing, which means that you study the craft of writing for 5 years and write a novel or a memoir or a poetry collection in the last 3 years. And you have to do all the exams and all of that. But that's your thesis: a memoir, a poetry collection, a novel, a book of essays. That's your thesis. So it's fun if you really. But these are writers who come to study with us in our program after long years of writing. And at this point, they feel that if they go to an institution space, they will be benefited. They feel that a critical eye on their writing will help them become better writers. Um, this is the way they hope that they would grow. And I think that's where the creative writing program steps in. I don't think creative writing programs create writers. I think creative writing programs help writers. So if you are a writer already, a creative writing program will help you. And the onus is never on the teacher. The onus is on the student. The onus is on the student to take the notes. I have mentioned 5 to 10 different writers and their books today. If somebody is interested in writing, they would take down those notes and go to the library tomorrow, or get the books online, download it in the Kindle, would do whatever, because that's what every writer I knew used to do. They like Right nowadays there is internet, but when I was growing up, to know the name of a writer was a big deal. Somebody mentioned Philip Roth. Oh my God, who is he? Let's go and find him. Like you go and find Philip Roth. Somebody mentioned Harold Robbins, and we ran to Panbajar to find that he writes his sultry novels. So you discover that way, and that's the only way to become a better writer. Nowadays, of course, in the age of internet, you don't have to worry about not knowing the names of writer. But I'm talking about 20 years ago, when knowing the name of a writer was a revolutionary, revelatory, eureka moment, where we just ran to Panbajar, the book market in Guwahati, in search of the writer. Uh, Creative writing programs help existing writers who have been writing, and a writer is born only by writing regularly and reading regularly.
Thank you. There's another question from Prarthana Aruni. What is the more effective way of writing a story, in the first person or the third person?
Okay. I actually like writing in first person very much. But there is third person omniscient narrative. There is also like the second person, which is difficult, where that one. But I enjoy writing in first person because it limits a lot of the noise. It cuts out a lot of the noise. Like if I write a story in first person, which means that I don't know what is going on in the mind of the character in front of me. So that I don't have to think about it. So that's really wonderful. Also, I like personally writing in first person. A lot of people don't like writing in first person. I love writing in first person. Like I can become a woman, I can become a man, I can become a kid, I can become anybody, like by inhabiting, because reading is about the experience of inhabiting other bodies. It's a crash course on empathy, reading. And similar way, writing is about that, Like it's about inhabiting other bodies, you know.
Okay, and then there's another question from I don't know the person's name, but well, I guess from the question it means did you face any difficulties in publishing your collection of short stories, His Father's Disease?
Yes, nobody wanted to publish it except one publisher. Everybody rejected it. Even my own publisher, Penguin, rejected it. And their rejections were like this: we love these stories, they're brilliant and they're wonderful, they're the best stories I've ever read in my life, but sorry, we can't publish it, nobody will buy them. So you can understand, you know, like people say that, oh God, you know, people with contacts get published. Like I know everybody in the Indian publishing industry, so so you can understand that it's the market that determines everything. So publishers think that publishers. I mean, I worked in Delhi publishing briefly. I know people in publishing. These are editors who know me, and they still nobody wanted to publish. I'm literally telling Penguin, Pan Macmillan. I never got rejections from some of the publishers. My own publisher, Penguin, rejected it, uh, and and it's mainly because you know, like they don't know. They think that short stories are not marketable. One of the publishers said that I don't know how to sell short stories, and this is a commissioning editor, and I'm like, if you can't sell short stories, why are you a commissioning editor in a prestigious publication house? Like, if you can sell an erotica, that's no big deal. If you can sell a thriller, it's not a big deal. If you can't sell art, why are you in publishing? It's just so hilarious, but at the same time very heartbreaking, because I thought, good Lord, my literary career is over in India, like, because nobody wants to publish. All these rejections are coming in. But it really, you can't take it personally. You just have to write the next collection. At a certain point, I told my agent, please let's withdraw the collection. I'll write a new book. I can always write a new book. And she's like, don't worry, we'll find a publisher.
Was the rejection because because it was a collection of short stories, or because of the themes of the short stories?
People rejections are really smart now. No, people won't say that, oh my God, you know, these are like dangerous themes we don't want to work with. They will say, we'll, most of the rejections, like they go like this. As I said, this is a brilliant collection of stories, we love Aruni's work, but we are very worried that short stories will not sell. That's the summary of most of the rejections. Some people are honest and said, like, oh, I can't sell short stories, but then that's like, it's questionable. You are an editor in a literary publishing house. If you can sell, I can sell the thriller by Jonas Bo, or you know, anybody. That's not a big deal. Thrillers we always sell. You don't even have to market them. So I don't know. You can never know what is the reason behind that. But I would say this has been my experience. And context, they are political, and my publisher context, they are deeply political. They want to publish political books. They want to publish books that engage in social conversation, and they actually publish very little fiction. So I think one or two fiction titles were published that year by them, and mine was one of them, if I'm not wrong. uh, but having said that, you know, one can get really depressed and bitter about this, or one can just like keep it aside and write the next book. That's what I did. I wrote another book. By the time, by the time my short story collection found a home, I had finished writing the first draft of my next novel, and I was revising the second draft of my Assamese book. You cannot let these things bog down. Nobody said, Aruni, here is a gun next to your head, and you have to write novels from today. I chose to do this. I could have done MBA.
Then there is another question from Ria, who asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned as you were creating your books?
The characters you want to kill refuses to die. They go on a date and sleep around.
That's a good one. That's very true.
You can't control your characters. If writing is going well, it's very hard to rein your characters. They get a life of their own. You want to kill them, they will refuse to die. They're resilient.
Right.
That is the most surprising thing.
In fact, let me just ask you a follow-up
I'm very
question.
serious. I'm actually very serious. It sounds like I'm
No,
joking. I think somebody might think, but I'm really
it's
serious. It's just impossible.
yeah, no, you're right that I think your work acquires a life of its own. And as you said earlier, you kind of start by setting out to doing something, and then it actually ends up becoming something entirely different, and then you might actually enjoy your unexpected creation, and then it takes on a life of its own. Um, but
Absolutely.
uh, but yeah, and actually, just as a follow-up question to Barry's question, this whole question of how do you teach creative writing also becomes a challenge, isn't it? Because as you said, the onus is on the student and not so much on the teacher. But the thing is that sometimes it becomes a little tricky negotiating with your students literary concerns, ethical concerns, imaginative concerns, and your own concerns. And it's not like you necessarily impose yourself, but but there are times when you're kind of you have to negotiate a lot with your students, isn't it?
But you have to negotiate a lot about uh, everything, even when you're teaching literary theory, even when you're teaching postcolonialism, even when you're teaching
Right.
Shakespeare. I think that negotiation exists everywhere.
Yes.
But and the other thing is that I think there's a lot of moralistic approach to the teaching of creative writing. People say, "Oh my God, this is like innate, talented," um, and so on, but people fail to understand that it could be innate, it could be talent, but you have to hone it. So how do I teach creative writing? uh, Undergraduates is a completely different ball game. You give them prompts to write, and that kind of jumpstarts the creativity, and they have like they have fun with the prompts, and then we read extensively. Like we would read a story and say, let us see how characterization is done in this story and see what we can learn from this writer. That's what those discussions are very valuable. It is only a creative writer who can bring the discussion, how characterization is done, because I do it every day. So I can go and share what I do and what other writers do because I'm interested in how other writers create characters, and just have a discussion with the student. This is not something an academic on literature is possibly capable of doing, as well as I can do. Just the same way, a person who is an early modernist can talk about early modern literature much better way than me, for example. So that's what. The other thing is that with postgraduate students, MFA, master's students, and PhD students, you are a very brutal editor of their work in some ways. By editing, I don't mean line editing and comma change. I mean that you read their advanced drafts and push them to make them better by asking the hardest questions. Why is this scene not well done? Why is this character inconsistent? Why is this character so interesting but is not developed fully? Let us develop fully. Why this subplot kind of wanes away? You know, or why are these questions that are raised in the story but never really answered? You ask these questions, and the writers usually come with a lot of experience, and and basically then they go ahead and revise them, and that is a very valuable thing. That is the teaching of creative writing. I do that with my editor.
Yes. Yeah. No, actually, the reason why I asked you that is I feel like sometimes it's a question of degree, not a question of kind between, let's say, teaching literary theory or postcolonialism and literature. Because when you actually teach creative writing, people often take it very personally. Criticism, because it seems like it's their own personal expression. And sometimes students often say, I've put in so many hours of writing into writing this, and how can you not like it then? So it's almost like as though you've put in so much more time, you have to have liked it. But if you don't like it, then there's something wrong with you, And so, or you don't have taste, right? And so I think it becomes a little tricky there, to convince someone that it's not just a question of an emotional outpouring, but it's also a question of craft and how you craft something. And crafting also requires you to kind of detach or distance yourself from what you're writing about. There's another comment from.
Yeah, I want to respond to that after this. Like I really, really agree with you, Kiran, when you said that. But at the same time, I think, after doing this for all these years, I have realized my job is to ask questions and
Yes.
and not even ask for the answers. I say, here are my questions. Go think about them and think if you think any of this is valuable. I think no editor no creative writing teacher should actually pass a judgment on a writing, but might point a finger and say, this is how I feel, go and think about it. That's what my job is actually to do, because it's art. It can't be resolved in a class discussion. And I think some instructors want to do that, and that leads to friction. Or some writers or students want to find immediate answers, that leads to friction. And a lot of the things about what you said, I mentioned it in my syllabus. I say that, you're going to remain silent when somebody's giving you feedback. You're only going to ask questions when at the end. This is mostly undergraduate. The postgraduate students come with a lot of experience, because the undergraduates are writing for the first time. And the other thing is that I also know that when I read an essay and a short story, I know that if I tell them 12 different things, they will never do or learn that. But if I tell them 5 things, they will do 3 of them. That's the joy. That's the achievement, because they are first year, second year students. It's just like trying to figure out how to express their life story, express their stories. So if I burden them with 15 suggestions, it'll be like crushing them. So you should also know that what really can they take, how much burden can they take. And once you become, and that comes with experience. Like I've done this for 10 years now, so I know who to give how much feedback and who is ready to take as much feedback. And by feedback, I mostly ask questions. Why is this? Why? Like mostly my questions are like 900 questions. My feedback is 900 questions. Why is this character not in scene 1 but in scene 2? Like that kind of thing. Why is this character? Why does this character die? Why can't we bring back the character? What will happen if the character is alive? So that pushes the writer to think in those directions, and they usually come with the solutions themselves. And eventually, it's their work. It's not my work. I can't write it for them. So that level of humility one has to have also. But it's really hard. It's a very contested space, the space of the workshop. I understand what you mean, but I have learned how to negotiate that space as much as possible.
Thank you. There's a question from Mayuri, who asks, why did you choose Tejimola out of all the Assamese folktales?
Very good question. It's because Tejimola is a popular story, number one. Tejimola also defines our relationship with the center, because that's the narrative that most insurgent organizations, most dissident organizations, most pressure groups use. If you look closely in the newspapers on the other political rhetoric of Assam, they always say that Delhi amak mahiyai dore treat kore, amak Tejimolar sokure sa baba eneke koi, which means that Delhi always treats us the way the stepmother in Tejimola's story treated Tejimola. Like nowhere else in the world probably the poor stepmother is so vilified, except in Assam, and that because of the popularity of the Tejimola story. So I think the Tejimola story acts as a political commentary in that sense. And I'm not the only writer who has written it. There are many, many more writers who have actually retold the story. They've written novels from the perspective of Tejimola's mother, like Tejimola Makor Khadhu is a novel. Uddipana Goswami has a poem on the Tejimola. Nitu Das has a poem on the Tejimola. There's an entire collection called Punar Janam Loi Tejimolai by Monalisha Soikia. So Tejimola is a big myth and a big legend, big story in Assamese imagination. So I think it's a very fecund space to tap into. That is why I chose Tejimola. And more importantly, it's a story of resilience. Tejimola doesn't die. You chop her off, she turns into a goat plant. You chop the goat plant, she turns into a joratenga. You chop the joratenga, she turns into a lotus. She is not going to give up. She's going to come back repeatedly. In some ways, it tells us about the sentiment in Assam's sense of discrimination, Assam's sense of being treated badly, and all the ideological movements, both violent and non-violent, that has emerged from it, the literature that has emerged from it, of being different, of being cast out, of being under ASPA. These are ideas. They're not going to go away with a generation. They always find different forms of manifestation again and again and again, with all flaws and all strengths. So that is why Tejimola's story is really important for me.
Thank you. And there's another question from Kaustav. Is there any remarkable LGBTQ character or novel in Assamese literature?
I don't know remarkable, but most of the time in Assamese literature, the LGBTQ characters are depicted as rapists, child molesters, murderers, and other bad people. So I don't think, even if there are, they're not really many remarkable characters. I can't really recall. Usually it is seen as something terrible. That's the move. But I think Mamuni Royisam Goswami's novel, Uday Bhanu Saritra, has it's written, I can't believe that it was written in the like late 70s or early 80s, I think. It was a very progressive, very beautiful, sensitive depiction of a gay character called Horace Shore. He doesn't mention he's gay, but you know that it's very beautifully suggested. Because he's being gay is not the story. Like, that's not the primary thing. He desires this character called Uday Bhanu, and Goswami treats it as if it is a matter of fact. It's not like a big deal. But if you read, say, a novel like Mukti by Monikudala Bhattacharya, she treats homosexuality as this matter of like fetishized curiosity in the novel. And one of the very beautiful novels, novellas, John Ishara Khandhanat. I really like that novel. There is a gay character, but he rapes the main character, Debashis. So the only reference is that gay people are probably like rapists. That's the way it is represented. Then there's also like really sort of unhealthy curiosity about queer characters, queer people. There's a novel called Pandikoy College or Bijoni Lesbian, two lesbians from Pandikoy College. Again, very unflattering depiction of lesbian women. And what a terrible name to have a novel by Govinda Prasad Sharma. There are many depictions, but I think new writers are writing it in a more sensitive way. Orup Kumar Nath, he's a professor in Bharati College. He has some short stories and on novellas. One of them is called The Hilar Hilalipi. And there is one more, I forget the name of the short story again. I think it's called Donghon, where basically there are queer men and they are depicted quite sensitively. Panchanan Hazarika's short stories has some sensitive depictions of queer characters. So it was like really, I grew up reading all these really violent images and very ugly images of gay men and lesbian women. And I wanted to like, damn, when I write my stories, I'm not going to do this, like I'm going to write them as everyday people. So that was one of my things actually when I wrote my collection. And actually, O'Neill, the character who appears in two short stories in his father, is the primary character in the House of a Thousand Stories. And people, if they read carefully, they will know that O'Neill is gay. But I never mentioned in my novel that O'Neill is gay. But in the collection, it is quite explicit, obviously, because his queerness leads to some devastating consequences. But so it has to be mentioned. But even if for the greater common good, Anil's queerness is there. It's not like he's not a unicorn. He's just another human being who's interesting. So I really wanted to sort of course correct in some way. And all these writers I mentioned, they actually wrote good novels, and these are very popular novels. But I think they didn't know how to approach the subject. And for some reason, I think Mamuni Royisam Goswami had so much empathy that she didn't make a big deal about it. She just wrote it beautifully. And to do it in the late 70s was not just brave, but also meant that someone had to be so sensitive, empathetic, and so well-read to be able to do that. That's why Mamuni Royisam Goswami was Mamuni Royisam Goswami.
Maybe you should translate your short stories into Assamese or write something in Assamese, some queer fiction in Assamese.
I think so, yeah, when I have a time to read.
Then there's one more question from Nyanesh. Yeah, you once said that you want to write for the marginalized. Do you feel writers who do not belong to that section can give a proper voice to the marginalized?
I don't want to write for the marginalized. I do want to write about the marginalized. I think the literature is for everybody to read, especially the non-marginalized. If I'm talking about the marginalized, um, I think anybody from anywhere can write about marginalized people with respect and empathy. I mean, look at Mahashta Devi. She wrote about the tribes in West Bengal. Most of her novels are about marginalized people, but she was a pretty privileged person. She was an upper caste Brahmin, but she did it with empathy and respect and love. She was not trying to fetishize them at all. She really wanted to help, and she was very respectful, to the extent that she went and lived with them. She spent a lot of time with them. I think she also brought out a newspaper called Barta for people in the tribal areas, and she wrote them in an accessible Bangla so that people could read that, because the language of the mainstream newspaper was hard um, for people in underprivileged areas to understand. And Munirasam Goswami has done that always. She always wrote about the subalterns. She always wrote about people who were in Senabor Shruto. She wrote about the laborers in Mamunadhara Toruwal. She wrote about she again wrote a novel about the people who worked at the aqueduct site in Sai River, I think it was. In Nilakanti Braja, she wrote about the widows in Nilakanti Braja. She always wrote about marginalized. I mean, and in some ways, she herself as a woman, as a widow, was marginalized, but she also belonged to one of the most prominent families in Assam. This didn't stop her from writing about people in marginalized sections, people who are backward. I think anybody who wants to write about anything, it is fiction. This is not, um, this is art. You can do anything you want as long as you approach with respect and empathy.
Thank you, Aruni. Any other further questions from the audience? You can unmute yourself and ask. Any more questions?
Kiran, I have some.
Yes,
This
please.
is Millie. So, hi,
Hi,
Aruni. First of all, thank you for
so lovely to see you
yes,
finally after the Bihu in
yes, after
Minnesota.
so many years. So, প্ৰথমে
Yeah.
thank you আমাৰ প্লেটফৰ্মত আহি পেলাই আমাৰ লগত কথা কোৱাৰ কাৰণে, and bring the voice of Assam and bringing Assamese stories to uh, the bigger world, basically. So সেইটো এটা কথা. Then তুমি কিমান often অসমলৈ আহা? Because you write so much about Assam, so do you how often do you come to
Every
Assam?
summer, প্ৰত্যেক summerতে মই যাওঁ.
Hi.
I go every summer, and
Okay.
sometimes I go in the. But I moved to the US only in 2018, so it was uh, I was in Minnesota for 3 years, but then I went back to India. So it's too early for me to say how often do I go, but yeah, I go in summer, every summer for sure.
So because you have such a talent, and one of the reason why we started this whole webinar, because we want the Assamese talent or talent from Assam to stay in Assam and be in Assam and inspire other people, other young generation. So now we would like to somehow get you back to Assam. Of course, you are already doing so. তাত থাকিও কৰি আছা, হয় নে নহয়? So and now we are a platform, we are trying to build a platform. So আমি কেনেকে help কৰিব পাৰো? How can we get your knowledge? Maybe about writing, or if some workshop you want to do, have, and Anajuri could be there, we can collaborate, because we would love your knowledge back to your root, and however we can help, that will be এটা question সেইটো কি কৰিব পাৰো আমি, because তোমাৰ talentটো লাগে আমাক, আৰু আৰু for me as a person, মই ইমান নপঢ়ো, to be honest, because for me a person is a book, like knowing your story. For me, I'm interested knowing Aruni Kashyap and your stories, your book, Kiran's book. you know. So, but I am lazy. I listen to book on tape. So, any of your book will come on tape or
On
audio?
maybe, yeah, maybe on Audible, but I don't know yet. I have to ask
Okay.
my publisher actually. But you are already reading. If you are listening to books on Audible, that's reading. You know, that's counts as reading, so that's okay.
But
And
it
coming,
limit me because
hmm?
my Hennepin library. I am a member of Hennepin
Right,
library, and I listen to all the book which is available in Hennepin County Library even now. That I'm a
right,
garden
right.
courier, so I listen to books. But it makes me limited because only certain amount of books are available, or
Yeah,
and
yeah. Um,
downloadable
I think
on.
my first novel might be on Audible soon. I have to ask my publisher what are they planning to do. But
Okay.
I'll let you know when I get to know. আৰু অসমত যদি মই যাওঁ তেতিয়া ডেফিনেটলি মই এতিয়া মনলৈ একো অহা নাই কি কৰিব পাৰো, বাট কিন্তু আমি ডেফিনেটলি আমি কোলাবৰেট কৰিব পাৰো। মই যদি কেতিয়াবা মই ভাবো যে আহ, অসমত বহুত ভাল লেখক আছে, ইয়াং লেখক আছে, তেওঁলোকক যদি অলপ হেল্প কৰিব পৰা যায় ৱৰ্কশ্বপ এটা পাতি, সেইটোও সম্ভৱ। আৰু এটা কথা মই দেখিছো, এই বিষয়ে মই পিছত পিছত বিতংকে ক'বলৈ মই খুব ভাল পাম। সেইটো হৈছে মোক বহুতো অসমৰ ল'ৰা ছোৱালীয়ে মোক যোগাযোগ কৰে PhD কেনেকৈ এপ্লাই কৰে এই বিষয়ে। And sorry, I've switched to Assamese. I'm going to talk in English so that everybody understands. A lot of people actually from Assam contact me, Assamese Lara Swali, boys and young students, and both male, female, all kinds of people from all levels of education. But they don't know a lot of things that in the United States and Canada, PhD is fully funded, number one. They don't know how to apply. I think Anajori can do something, and I'll be very happy to help, because there are many people who regularly contact me, and there's a whole sort of, they don't know anything about the foreign application process. I think these students need help, and we can help them, so that they are talented people. It's just that they don't know the rules and regulations and the clauses and how to navigate that. They're not trained to write a statement of purpose. If they get some feedback, maybe they can come and do research here and take that back to Assam someday.
Okay, that will be great. We will reach out to you. So, sorry, I have two more small questions. So you said that the
Sure.
first novel in Assamese did not, first, second, third, you said fifth, but are they published now? What happened to do now that you are famous? Now, did they agree to any of this book published?
No, they are not published, but they are in my office, and I don't want to publish them. I think my editors then did me a favor by rejecting them.
Okay, okay. And any of your movie, your story will turn to movie?
I hope so. Like there are people keep contacting me, but nothing really has sort of finalized. People do talk, regularly email people who read my work, but again, there is nothing that I can announce at this point.
Okay. And the final question, is that for a young generation, like if somebody is listening from some corner of Assam and they want to become an author, they are not sure whether you can really make money by being an author. What do you suggest, or what do you advise them? Should they be, or just some advice to them? Do you really make money being an author?
No. Very few authors actually make money in India if they want to be an author. Um, Also, 2020, 21st century is a time when authors' book sales are dwindling across the world. So we have to keep that reality in mind. It is only a very few number of authors who can actually make money if they want to write literary fiction. So a lot of authors actually end up working in the university system where the teaching load is slightly lesser, and they can teach creative writing, they can teach literature, and also write their work. Um, I think one has to be very realistic, and I always tell people who ask me these questions that don't leave your job. Leave your job when you can leave your job. And I think this is a story of many writers who have made like millions of money. They actually have a day job until they can live off their royalties. that is the reality. The world today is, I mean, I'm not even talking about the developed world because the concerns are different, but even in the developed economies, it is hard to be an author and make a living out of selling books. And in India, it's, where the economy is going downhill right now, I wouldn't even recommend anybody to leave any job. Like, hold the jobs with your dear life until things get better in India.
Thank you. Thank you, Aruni. Thank you, Kiran.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Aruni. I think if there are no further questions, then we can conclude the session here. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Aruni. I really enjoyed
Thank
this
you.
interaction and
Thank you so much, Kiran.
rich and productive conversation. I hope we continue to have many such conversations in the future. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.